The mayor of Kansas City, Quinton Lucas, is here. We always appreciate his time each and every week at this time on 95.7 FM, KCMO Talk Radio. So on Monday Night Football, of course, the Chiefs beat the Commanders. Unfortunately, the Western Auto sign was not lit up, and that means it could not have been part of any big skyline shots. But the mayor has been teasing that a big fix is coming. So here he is to break the news on KCMO. Good morning, Mr. Mayor. How are we going to light that baby back up?
Well, you know, occasionally people accuse me of being non-substantive. I have had substantive posts this week, non-fatal shootings down 30%, lots of other things in Kansas City, but this has in many ways garnered the most attention. The Western Auto sign, of course, is owned by a private entity, the HOA of the Western Auto Lofts. They have paid themselves to fix it over the years. Of course, in Kansas City, we have an Illuminate KC program that has lit up both public spaces and a private one. We're evaluating that here. So I would expect us to have more to announce, not quite yet, but hopefully in the days and weeks ahead about how that sign can be relit. It is a classic, and I don't. Some have reached out, my friends in organized labor and beyond, who said, hey, you know, we can fix it. It's not really a huge fix other than there are a bunch of bulbs, there are some cords and others that need to be done. Not that it's simple, but, you know, I think it just needs some TLC and probably a sustainable plan for how its fixes can be funded.
So it's not that HOA doesn't want to pay the electric bill. It's that they don't want to pay to fix up whatever needs to be fixed.
Right. Yeah. Compare it to an old house, and there's just something that goes out with more regularity because it's old. And so this is not a modern LED sign. I know people have talked about, can you update it? That really does fundamentally change it. It's amazing that we used to just have these signs all around the city. Of course, this was a form of advertising back in the day before you had lit up billboards and all the other things. So I expect it to be addressed. This is kind of part of us making sure that our city is ready to shine, not just for the World Cup, but long after, and proud to be part of it all.
Well, you mentioned there, Mr. Mayor, the non-fatal shootings down 32% year over year, and that is obviously welcomed news. Unfortunately, the homicide number is more or less about the same as where it was last year at this point. So how do you interpret the fact that non-fatal shootings are down, but homicides are basically the same, and what do you do to ultimately get that second number down?
Yeah, you know, so homicides are down by about 5 people. That is down 129 to 124. So you're right, a single-digit percentage is the change. Where non-fatals, you have 30+%. You know, I think a few things relate to that. One, and I hate to be macabre in the morning, but yeah, here we are. It suggests to us that you are seeing less of the shootings where people are spraying in crowds. That was a problem of 2024. You actually have seen that in years earlier in Kansas City, those mass shootings of 9 people, of obviously 24, the Chiefs parade, all types of things like that. Now you are seeing more incidents where people are intending to kill the target. And so I think on a positive, that suggests to us random shootings, drive-by shootings, some of those are down in more places, which is a good thing. But we're also seeing interpersonal relationships, domestic violence, homicides, those sorts of engagements continuing at the same pace. What that tells me is that we are actually making very real progress in both entertainment district reduction on shootings and, frankly, the more gang-related, back-and-forth group-related violence. That is good. However, right, you still have lots of arguments that are leading to homicides, those kind of close engagements where you see higher fatal numbers. Two big problems. I think one shows progress, but certainly other concerns remain.
So this is something that came up last week. We had on the city manager, Mario Vasquez, and he was great. We would appreciate him stopping by and coming on the show. So he brought up the fact that KCPD's budget is going to be up 20% next year. And listeners will know that, you know, I will support the men and women in law enforcement as much as anybody with a microphone in this town. But I'm trying to figure out what that's being used for. He expressed some frustration with that number. He didn't hold back on that. You're on the Board of Police Commissioners. You have a say. He obviously does not. So what is the 20% justification around?
No, and look, Mario's right, and I'm sure either the police chief or Brad Lemon can come on to tell you how right they are, but, I am more on the Mario position, which is that A 20% increase is fairly dramatic given government conditions at every level of government. The state of Missouri is expecting a $1 billion revenue decline next year. The city of Kansas City expecting $100 million. The federal government is just a total disaster. So first, there's a budget reality in which we all live that the Board of Police Commissioners, not surprising because of their setup, apparently doesn't believe they exist in. On the other point, I think that there are some very real costs that are in the proposed budget. Body-worn cameras at $3 million a year, other contractual service increases. And I think it's fair to say the people of Kansas City just cannot afford this next year. I think there is a way that you continue, and as we have done in recent years, robust increases in officer pay. We've seen officer pay increase at least every year of the last several years, and really mightily. And by the way, those budget increases were about 8% last year, 12% the year previous, and we have changed lives with some of our pay increases, increased officer numbers, right, done real work to catch up. The 20%, I think, is excessive. I think anybody who's reasonably looking at budgets would know it is. And I think the city manager is right to suggest that the city needs to have further negotiation with the Board of Police Commissioners as to what it's all about. Because a 20% increase, we expect, a heck of a lot more. I don't know if we're seeing that promise in the next budget, and I want everybody to get paid as best they can, but I'm not going to lay off a bunch of other city workers and firefighters and others just to, have in some ways a bloated police budget.
The only conclusion I came to is increasing 20% because you have to have that 25% threshold of the city budget go into KCPD based on the state law. Is if you increase the entire city budget 20%, so then therefore to get to 25, you had to increase police budget by 20%. But that's not what you're doing here, just so I'm clear on that.
Not at all. Not at all. Indeed, and I'm not saying this is the way it's going to be, but this is the problem with the 25% metric that the police department and the prior Board of Police Commissioners worked so hard for. If general revenues are actually down by $100 million, and by the way, that isn't bad spending. That is actually just the revenues coming into the city. People shopping in a different way. We did roll back our Jackson County property taxes as were required in jurisdictions. That means that their 25% threshold at PD would drop. I'm not saying that's where we go, but right, there is a budget reality in which all of our agencies have to live. And I have said this time and time again. We are not laying off city workers. We are not going to cut core services. I talked to somebody in the city who was saying, well, I guess we could just cut demolition of all dangerous buildings because we're not going to have millions to do it next year if we do some of these other steps. The police department is very important. It's vital. It's probably one of the most important issues in Kansas City. We need to make sure we right-size the budget. I was able to get budgets with 8% increases to KCPD, 12% increases to KCPD. They paid our officers a lot more and has treated them better. I have always cared about how we pay our officers. I care nothing about all the bells and whistles, the other issues, the litigation, which, by the way, if you look at the budget, I think is about a $7 or $8 million just fund draw. And a place that sticks in my craw, and probably the city managers, is that they're just passing it on to the taxpayers in the next budget. Right? That was a vote of 5 people on the Board of Police Commissioners that just jumps to everybody else that in many ways reduces funding available for our officers each day. Mm-hmm. We have got to right-size those issues. That's what's important, not just frankly bloating things and not addressing the underlying concern.
But you would say, I'll say this much too. You're on the board, obviously, so you've got to say in all this. The city manager does not. And it seems like the city does have a problem in many departments in just settling these lawsuits and paying people off. And how does that end and how does that get better?
Look, yes, there's a problem. I will say, however, it's different among our departments, and I'm just going to be fair to you on this. Everybody covered a lawsuit relating to our last city manager, and it was embarrassing, and he ended up separating from the city, all types of issues. It was a $900,000 settlement. Right? It wasn't a $10 million hit, separate from a $4 million hit, separate from a $5 million hit. The sustained level of activity and payments that we are paying out of the KCPD budget, which basically comes out of the whole city budget, is not sustainable for the Kansas City taxpayer. Partially because a lot of them are going to end up being wrongful death suits, although we have some fairly substantial employment settlements too. So if the city of all 4,500 employees is paying less at the end than perhaps litigation from the KCPD, there's a very real problem because KCPD is much smaller. So I do think we need to address it. I think that's something, frankly, the Missouri legislature needs to step in for, because this type of litigation will defund the Kansas City and St. Louis police departments. And you can call the mayors of both cities evil liberals and all of that and say how terrible they are, but I think the city of St. Louis Police Department had an $18 million verdict recently. That's the sort of thing that you can't just find under a cushion in the city budget somewhere. We need change at Jefferson City. We obviously need change in some of our procedures to try to avoid it. And I think that's the pressure we need to put on before we're just increasing every budget year over year 20%.
Yeah. I mean, I've seen, the water department's had issues too, though, right, with lawsuits. So it's been are we getting the attorney to lobby on behalf of tort reform in Jeff City? Is that what I'm hearing?
You have gotten an attorney to lobby on behalf of public entity tort reform in Jefferson City. Absolutely. I just don't think that the people of Kansas City, look, they want responsibility and accountability for a police department, which is why I hate state control. But I don't think that when people are paying their taxes, they're saying, yeah, we understand that 15 to 20% of this is going to be skimmed off the top of general revenues to go to paying out settlements. And I grieve for every victim in our state. And so absolutely egregious cases of misconduct, there should be some level of justice. I would argue the criminal justice system provides that. I do not think that police departments and fire departments are the same as, AT&T and others that can pay out much larger settlements, largely because we don't get to generate profits the same way they do. If we did, all right, apply it to us. But the Kansas City Police Department can't make a 30% profit this year. At least they sure shouldn't. And so I think it should be seen differently by the Missouri legislature. I hope they will step in. I'll happily tell my friends in the trial bar that as well.
Well, interesting. I could keep going there. I'm not sure if profits should determine whether or not you can get sued, but I see what you did there. I get it.
Sure.
Mayor Lucas on KCMO. All right, speaking of millions of dollars, KCATA says it's got to get to $10 million to have the bus system that it needs for the World Cup next year. Where's the money for a city that you noted is going to be down $100 million shortfall in revenues versus expenses? Where are you getting $10 million for World Cup transportation?
I don't know. And by the way, this brother, will you please spare me a dime? Act does get a little tired after a while. I mean, I'm not one who loves this sort of lobbying in the press before we have these discussions in some of the government agencies. I have heard this in the press. I met with ATA not long ago. There was not a discussion of a 10 million or bust World Cup initiative. That being said, if that is the situation, the KC 2026 group, for which the city of Kansas City has already invested $15 million, far outpacing the next local government jurisdiction, which is Johnson County, Kansas, that's put in $1.5 million, so 10% of what we gave. I think the regional entity should speak to KCATA about how we can further support bus service that they're expecting to have more riders come World Cup time, if that is the issue. I just don't think that these things should just be sticking it to the taxpayer again and again. The Kansas City taxpayer currently pays a half-cent sales tax for mass transportation. I believe a 5/8 cents on another version of mass transportation. Kansas City taxpayers are putting a lot of money into public transportation right now. Kansas City, Missouri taxpayers. I think to the extent that this is a regional event, then we should look to more regional sources to help support not just KCATA come World Cup time, but more fundamentally KCATA long term.
All right. Well, we'll see how that one plays out. But you have not heard, this is not something you've discussed. You're kind of learning about this through the press, is what I'm hearing.
I am. Look, okay. and here's the thing. I had a meeting with ATA probably a month ago in my office, sitting around talking. We chatted about a few different things. It's not as if there's an inability to chat. And so, here's the problem. I was just talking about public entities and lawsuits, and maybe people agree or disagree. I also think public entities and how you market yourself. Something that I have disliked greatly, and I've seen a lot as mayor, is folks who really go to the press and say, sky is falling, all of that, to try to get what it is I guess they believe they're entitled to. I don't think that's the way this should be done. I do actually think you should go to the boring meetings. You should say, here's a fiscal plan. You should stand for questions, and that's how you handle it. You don't go on Channel 4 or your favorite channel, whatever, and just say, yeah, things are terrible and all of that. So then we get a microphone in our face, and they say, well, hey, they said things are terrible. What are you going to do? This negotiation in the press is not the way any of these things should be done. And I wish that it was something that probably, subsided just a little bit in Kansas City, particularly as we come around budget time.
Mayor Lucas is here. All right. I want to thank you as well after last week. Your fine press secretary and the communications department did put this interview in your weekly rundown that gets sent out on Sunday. So thank you for that. I do appreciate it. And I will also ask you this in the last few days until the big elections in other parts of the country. I don't see any trips to New York City for Mamdani on the rundown here. Is that something you're doing at the last minute, or are you staying away from that one in New York City?
You know what? I got no qualms with Zoran Mamdani. I think, I was elected at the age of 34. He's 34 too, much larger city. But I think there's this fear of a parade of horribles coming if Zoran's elected. I just don't see it the same way. But to the extent I'm engaged in elections, I put up some thoughts on the independence 4-day school question, which I am against, and a few others. But I'm going to let the New Yorkers figure it out, just like the New Jerseyans and the Virginians. And we'll talk next Thursday about what this means for Democrats taking over Congress in fall of 2026.
All right. There you go. A wishful thinking Mayor Lucas on a busy Thursday. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Appreciate the time.
Hey, have a good one. Go Chiefs over Bills this weekend.
Yes, big game. There you go. The mayor of Kansas City on KCMO.